This is Concepts, where two pretentious sirs quibble over ideas that explain today's world. Phil Shea and Steve Rose. My name is Phil Shea. I am writing for makeaskillcheck.com, and you can find more writing by me at hittingeject.com. Steve?
My name is Steve Rose, and you can find more about me at steverosephd.com, where I write about mental health and addiction.
Today we have a guest. It's our first guest, and he has had TEDx talks a number of times throughout the talk here. We reference as TED Talk. It's not a TED Talk, it's a TEDx talk for those who want to nitpick. He is the executive director of the Reconomics Institute, and he is also an author, among other things. He's got a whole interesting background that we don't actually touch on too much, but his most recent book is called Reconomics, The Path to Resilient Prosperity, out in 2020. If you like this, let us know, and we would be happy to do more of them. Today, welcome Storm Cunningham. Thanks for joining us. We're going to be talking about urban revitalization, a strategic process. Thanks for coming on the show.
I appreciate you having me on the show, Phil.
Great. So what can you tell us about urban revitalization?
Oh, man.
It's a big question, I know. We're starting off very broad.
Well, probably the simplest way to approach that would be just to focus in on the aspect of urban revitalization that I deal with. There are so many other aspects of it, the design aspects that architects and engineers would deal with, and economic and social and environmental, and I deal with all of those different things. But the aspect I most commonly work with is the one that's the greatest source of failure in urban revitalization initiatives worldwide. You can screw up just about any aspect of it, bad designs, environmental undermining, unequitable or inequitable economic revitalization. I mean, there's so many ways to do it wrong. But I've been doing this full time now for over 20 years, and the whole time I've been looking for commonalities. I've been speaking at summits and conferences and conventions and planning meetings all over the world now. And for every talk I gave, I normally heard at least a dozen. So I've probably heard more stories of revitalization success and failure than anybody else on the planet. And the thing that jumped out is that places tend to be really good at doing projects, converting a building, from a hotel to apartments, or cleaning up a brownfield and putting something more productive on it, and doing infrastructure renewal or restoring their watershed, all kinds of revitalizing projects that contribute to the revitalization of the area. Where they fall down is on the overall program, the overall initiative that's meant to produce either revitalization or resilience, or preferably both, since you want your revitalization to last, so you want it to be resilient. And it's that overall initiative that tends not to have any kind of process. I mean, everybody who produces anything knows you need to have a process. Doesn't matter whether you're producing clothing or peanut butter or tax revenues or automobiles. You got to have a process. And the only people who don't seem to understand that are the people who are running revitalization and resilience initiatives. So what you see is cities doing a whole lot of wonderful projects, but still not getting that turnaround in their trajectory. They might be going downhill, or they might be stagnant, and all these wonderful projects don't change it because they don't actually have a process for producing the end result that they're trying to achieve, which is revitalization.
Right. So what I'm hearing is you're saying that it sounds more like a lot of Band-Aid initiatives where it's a political kind of move, right? Like they want to have something that looks impressive, something big, and look, we did this thing, but the overall trend still seems to be towards, I think, what you call deconomics or deconstructive economics. Was that the term?
Yeah.
I'm referring to your talk on the TED Talk. Sorry, this is pretty old, but we'll link to that as well. But you made a distinction in that talk a lot of time about sustainable and restorative versus a number of dichotomies, like deconstructive economics versus reconstructive economics, de-wealth and re-wealth.
Right. My whole focus ever since I started writing the first book, The Restoration Economy, which I started writing in 1996, didn't come out till 2002. It's been on this whole de-re transition that you're referring to, so you could say it's development versus redevelopment. It's devitalization versus revitalization, demolition versus reconstruction, all of these de-re aspects. And what's happening is that because a lot of this revitalization activity is fairly new, there really isn't much rigor to it. People basically relying on hope and magic. They just do a lot of good projects and hope that somehow revitalization magically appears. And it's really strange that they're putting the future of their community or the region in the hands of hope and magic when they've got so many professionals involved. But the trouble is, up till now, there's been no real revitalization profession. So they've defaulted to, if they hire somebody to be in charge of revitalization, they might bring in a person with an economic development background, in which case their revitalization is based on stealing employers from other communities, usually by giving away big tax breaks, which undermines the city's economy long run. Or they'll hire an architect, so their revitalization becomes totally focused on design. And good design is important, but that's not the same as running a revitalization process. Or they hire engineers and their revitalization becomes all about infrastructure renewal. Or they hire planners and they spend 20 years writing plans and never actually doing anything. They get stuck in what I refer to as perpetual planning syndrome.
Right. You make a distinction between strategies and tactics. And I know this is kind of a military thing, and I'm wondering if maybe some of that comes from your background in the military. And the community is often doing tactics like planting some trees or putting some banners out on Main Street or whatever. And so strategy is the way you're pointing to as actual long-term sustainable revitalization. How would you define strategy in your approach?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's one of those words that everybody uses, but very few people really understand what it is. Oftentimes people use tactics and strategy synonymously, or they'll use plan and strategy synonymously. I ask people, so what's your strategy for revitalizing your downtown? And they'll pull a 200-page plan off the book and say, here you go. And I say, no, that's a plan. What's your strategy? It's hard to understand strategy unless you understand the whole context. So you start, ideally, a revitalization program initiative should start with an ongoing program. Because revitalization doesn't come from start, stop individual projects. You have to build momentum and build confidence in the future of the place. So that requires an ongoing program. And the very first thing that program should do is create a shared vision of what you're trying to achieve, what kind of community you want in 10 or 20 years. And then the strategy comes in, because the sole focus of the strategy, the only reason a strategy exists, is to achieve success. That's what a strategy is all about. It's a technique that will help you overcome whatever the primary obstacles are to achieving your vision. And that strategy can often be said in just a few sentences. In fact, some of the best strategies are just 3 words. The difference between a strategy and a plan is, if you want to put it in real terms, what happens is that plans become the end result. People can become so focused on creating a plan, they think they've succeeded when they've written the plan. And if you remember Dwight D. Eisenhower's quote, he says, planning is essential, but plans are useless. The plans actually become one of the major blockages to achieving revitalization, because everybody thinks that because they now have a plan, that things are going to happen, and nothing happens. The plan just goes on a shelf. 99% probably of all plans are never implemented. It's kind of a scam industry in a lot of ways, because mayors want easy, risk-free feathers to stick in their cap. So they'll announce to the public, we've commissioned a plan, and there's no risk in that. All they have to do is write a check. And then a year later, the plan arrives, they do another press conference, we've got a plan, and another feather in their cap, and still no risk. Well, the risk comes in if they try to implement it. Now they might fail. So the plan goes on the shelf, and 5 years later, there's a press conference, we're going to update our plan. So sometimes the strategy is how to overcome the planning department in order to revitalize a place, how to get the agencies that are actually standing in the way of revitalization to get out of the way. And those are usually the planning department or the economic development agency.
On this topic, I'm going to play slightly devil's advocate, because I know that people are going to be curious about this, and I'm actually curious myself. I've seen you talk about revitalizing communities and how it's good for them. And of course, we all want fresh air and clean water and a nice environment. But I know a lot of people are going to be hesitant with these kind of projects, because they're wondering, how would the investment be recouped for the municipality? Like maybe that's one of the reasons why they're just focusing on plans, because then it doesn't cost them very much and there's no real risk there, as you said. So what ways do these communities tend to earn money back through these endeavors?
Well, the fact is that if a community is not revitalizing, it's devitalizing. there's really no such thing as healthy stasis. So if they decide they don't want to take any risks by not investing in their community, their devitalization is guaranteed. So that's one of the paybacks, is that you actually have a better future. You can revitalize in just myriad ways. They don't all have to be capital intensive. You don't have to take big risks on aquariums and stadiums and convention centers and all these other what often turn out to be white elephant failures, run by mayors and their redevelopment buddies who are just looking to extract as much revenue from the taxpayers as possible and subsidize their businesses. Those are the risky ones. The real revitalization initiatives are the ones like I describe in the book Reconomics that came out last year, which have this complete strategic renewal process. And the very first part of that process, where you create the ongoing program and you create the shared vision, that's when you engage all the local stakeholders and you come up with a revitalization strategy that makes sense for the level of risk they want to take and the level of change, the pace of the change, and who is going to benefit from it. So their future is in their hands. But not doing anything, not making any investments is just as risky as investing.
On the topic of economics, in the climate discussion more broadly, I guess more at a national level, there's always this juxtaposition of economics on one hand and the climate on the other hand. If you give to one, you're taking from the other. And so there's this zero-sum game in this kind of broader discourse. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's just propaganda from the fossil fuel industries. They've been subsidizing all kinds of academic research and creating all kinds of phony nonprofit research institutions for 30 years now. And their sole purpose of all this phony scientific research is to create confusion of that kind. It's illegitimate. If you look at the real research, there is no such dichotomy.
No, I love your approach because it does integrate the economics with revitalization as one and the same. And you're not looking at it as like just volunteering to do something nice for your community. It's actually creating an industry around this. And there is an industry that I guess a lot of people don't know about.
Yeah, it's huge. The trouble is that it's not really organized. People don't treat revitalization as a discipline. So they just focus on all the individual parts. So you've got these huge AEC companies, architecture, engineering, construction companies doing huge projects, multi-billion-dollar projects, redeveloping cities. You've got huge ecological restoration projects like the $12 billion Everglades restoration project. You've got all of this restoration of fisheries and watersheds and renewal of infrastructure and restoration and reuse of historic buildings and catastrophe recovery and reconstruction. It's just everywhere you look. But the revitalization aspect, the revitalization is it is in a way kind of magical. It is something that emerges from a complex adaptive system, which is what a city is. And it's because of that emergent nature of it that it can't be engineered. You can't say on September 14th, 2023, revitalization is going to happen, like you can with a project where you say on that date a dam is going to be completed or a ribbon cutting on a building is going to be done. And it's that emergent, complex nature of it, and the fact that it's not controllable and that there are always going to be surprises, which is one of the defining characteristics of any complex living system, that terrifies engineers, terrifies planners, and terrifies leaders.
The example of Chattanooga, Tennessee is one that really stands out as kind of highlighting this revitalization and economic development coexisting. Would you mind sharing a little bit more on that particular example as a case study for this?
Yeah, Chattanooga is probably my favorite story in the United States for two reasons. One is because it was such a spectacular revitalization coming from such an incredibly low point and achieving such a high point in a relatively short period of time. So the simple dynamics of it make it a star. But the other aspect is that they probably the first community, at least in the United States, to create what I consider a complete strategic renewal process. It had all the elements. It had the ongoing program. It had the vision, the strategy. It had the policy work, the partnerships, and the projects. And those are the 6 elements that I consider the minimum viable process. And they were the first ones to do it all. And that is why they went from a point in the late 70s where Walter Cronkite, if any of you guys are old enough to remember who he was, but he got on national TV and announced that, according to the EPA, that Chattanooga was the filthiest city in the United States. Folks, they had so much coal-fired industry there, and because they were in kind of a valley, it concentrated, and people literally had to drive with their headlights on in the middle of the day.
Wow.
That was only one of many problems. They were hemorrhaging like 5,000 jobs a year at that point. It's not that big a city. And they had tremendous crime problems, racial problems. I mean, this is a city that was just a total basket case. In the process of cleaning up their air, after Walter Cronkite shamed them nationally, they decided, okay, well, let's take care of the air problem. And they did. They actually cleaned up their air and became the first recipient of the EPA's Clean Air Award. And that process of working together to clean up their air showed them that they could work together. And they decided, well, we've got this momentum now. We've got this cohesion, social cohesion. Let's keep on going. Let's revitalize our waterfront. That snowballed. They had a local foundation that was funding the creation of their ongoing program and their visioning process. And 20 years later, people were flying in from all over the world to see the Chattanooga Miracle. The first time I went there, I was walking around downtown, I came across a group of very well-dressed Vietnamese folks and asked them what they were doing in Chattanooga. And it turned out they were all government ministers from Vietnam who were coming to see this miracle they had been hearing about.
So I was actually curious, after talking about Chattanooga, have you heard anything about Sudbury, Ontario? We had a huge coal mining, I think strip mining issue there that was also revitalized. I was wondering if that popped up on your radar.
I've never actually been to Sudbury, but I've been kind of loosely following the story. In fact, I think I mentioned it in one of my books that I don't know, I haven't been following it lately. The story I mentioned in my book was the tailings from the mining activity had become such a visually arresting site that it become a tourist attraction. And when folks came in and decided they want to start reforesting the area, restoring the watershed, they actually had local people pulling out the trees because they didn't want to ruin the tourist industry that was seeing all this devastation as an attraction.
Oh, wow.
That's absurd. I didn't know that. I don't know why people would want to come and see a wasteland, but oh man, apparently it's gotten a lot better, as I guess you probably hopefully mentioned in the book. That's surprising. I wouldn't think there would be an economic interest in keeping something desolate.
Well, it's actually not that rare. If you go to Butte, Montana, the biggest tourist attraction in town is a copper mining pit. I mean, they've got a very lovely downtown with a lot of historic buildings, but the reason probably 70-80% of the tourists come is to look at the what I think might be the world's largest hole.
Yeah, man-made hole, I presume.
And the hole is rather notorious because the water at the bottom of it is so toxic that when migrating geese, when ducks come through and they land on it, they're usually dead the next morning.
Oh, wow. Okay.
What? Wow. Yeah, that's...
toxic tourism. I never knew it was a thing.
It's definitely a place that you want to go and see, of course. Why? I was actually curious. I missed a little bit in the middle there, but I was wondering if you have any opinions about the Green New Deal and everything coming along the lines with that.
It's got a lot of the right things in it. There's always going to be political grandstanding in any of these things. So I would say, yes, it's got a lot of really good thoughts. And if it were fully funded and implemented, it would do a lot of really good things, whether it's politically viable or not, and whether the people who put it together ever thought it would be politically viable. You know, there could be a grandstanding aspect to it there. But should it pass? Should it be fully funded? Absolutely.
And on that topic, because that's a national issue, from my understanding, we watched the Canadian election debates very recently, and the climate was one of the main sections of it. And all we heard was just visions, and they were very broad visions, not very specific, and they were all pretty much saying similar things. And so on the national level, there's the tendency to focus on visions, whereas on the municipal level, there's a tendency to focus on planning or tactics. And so they're kind of at opposite extremes there. What are your thoughts on that, on the national discourse?
Well, actually, there's a lot of dependence on visions at the community level, too. The plans that go onto the shelf and ignored are mostly a product of the city's agencies. They often are mandated. They're budgeted for ahead of time, and community is legally required to have a plan update every 5 years or 10 years or whatever. So that's kind of an institutional thing. But, many communities, especially those with large minority populations or people, low-income neighborhoods that are getting organized and starting to have some political power, their favorite way of, for the local leaders, the favorite way of getting these people off their back is to do visioning sessions. So I've been to cities that had literally dozens of visions. They're just doing visions right and left. And in many cases, it was just a feel-good exercise. They sometimes, these visioning sessions often have a very salutary effect on the neighborhood in terms of bringing people together and getting to talk about the future they want. And that's wonderful. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the visioning sessions themselves. The trouble is they're often being used, like I said, just to get them off the political leaders' back. So there's no follow through. So on the same shelves that you'll find all those comprehensive plans and revitalization plans and strategic plans, you'll also find the results of all these visioning sessions just going up there and being ignored because there's no strategy or process for implementing the vision. And the same thing with the whole design charrette trend. Or fad, really, that was going on in the earlier part of this century, usually around late 90s to about 2010, 2015 or so, before they started dying out. Yeah, you probably have different terminology for them up there in Canada. There's no real standard terminology for them down here in the States. They're often just called visioning sessions, which is different from design charrettes. Design charrettes are usually run by architects, and, they'll bring a bunch of people together for a kind of a workshop where they'll World Cafe type things where people break out into sessions and they'll come up with their ideas for the future of their neighborhood. And then people vote on the favorite ideas, and they'll stick colored dots on maps, and they'll have little building kind of like Lego things where they'll move buildings around on a map of the city or the neighborhood and say, well, what if we put this here and that there? It's all good stuff, but 99% of the time, it's not followed through on.
No follow through. Yeah, it seems like a lot of feel good kind of make people just feel like they're doing something, but not. It's kind of Machiavellian in a way where it's like, here, you can definitely help. Here are these things you can do. What should we do? All right, great. That goes right in the bin. Now let's move on to other things.
Yeah. It reminds me of vision boards in personal development. It's a concept that people cut out things from magazines and put it onto a board, and it's like a feel-good exercise in terms of like, someday I'll be this, and I'll have this body and this car, and it really reminds me of that as a parallel.
Yeah, visions are absolutely essential, but they're absolutely useless if that's all they are, is a vision.
In terms of the vision boarding for individuals, like I'm just trying to draw a parallel between that and communities. How do you know any research, Steve, on how vision boards actually work out? Do they actually help people much?
I haven't seen anything good about it. I'm actually curious to delve into that research more, but I haven't seen anything that's particularly useful about it. But yeah, there is an element of it being essential to know where you're going. And so instead of vision boards, I would say something in personal development like values is kind of more of what we would generally talk about. But as you said, urban revitalization is like magic, and strategy seems to be one of the big keys to unlocking that magic. And it's often the most neglected piece of this picture. And so I'm more curious about what is an example of a very specific strategy, or maybe even Chattanooga's strategy?
So once you have your vision and you've got a handle on what your assets are, what you have to work with, what I call renewable assets, which is the same thing a lot of communities call problems, derelict buildings, contaminated sites, things like that. The stuff that a lot of communities think of as being what's in the way of their revitalization, these are actually the renewable assets, which are the ingredients of the revitalization. So part of it is getting a handle on kind of like a SWOT analysis, figuring out where you are, what the threats are, what you have to work with, where the opportunities are. The strategy comes in terms of looking at where you want to go and what's standing in your way and figuring out how you're going to get there. And the reason I said there are some strategies that are only 3 words is because probably the single most effective revitalization strategy on the planet is just 3 words. I call it the 3 re strategy. And those 3 words are repurpose, renew, reconnect. And the reason it's so universally effective is because most communities, no matter what the differences are in their social systems, their value systems, their politics, their economies, their cultures, most communities, if they've been around for more than half a century, have the same problems. They've got contaminated lands, they've got derelict infrastructure, they've got derelict buildings, they've got stuff that either needs to be removed or renovated or redesigned or restored in some way. They've got depleted farmlands, depleted fisheries, depleted watersheds. So that you find the same problems everywhere, which means that to revitalize, they need to, in many cases, most cases, they need to find a new purpose for these derelict assets. And, like if they've got a waterfront that has been traditionally industrial, as many of them were, you're going to find all kinds of contamination and derelict buildings there. And to figure out how to revitalize the waterfront, the first purpose has to be, well, how can we repurpose those buildings? How can we repurpose that contaminated land? You have to find the new purpose for it before you can raise the money that you need to renew it. And, so that's why repurposing is the first thing. It's just kind of like with a person. If you want to revitalize your life, if somebody's discovered that their life is going down the crapper, they probably need to find out what their purpose for living is. And it's that much different from cities and properties. So you repurpose it. Then with that new purpose, you raise the money you need to renew it. This is kind of a standard thing. You go to any city and you'll find buildings and properties that have a new purpose and have been restored, renewed, renovated. The part that so many communities forget about is that last one, reconnect. Those waterfronts often got isolated because, these industrial waterfronts were dirty and dangerous and a place that nobody wanted to go to. So they often ended up fairly isolated, had fences around them. And the same thing with old industrial properties. The industry that was there is usually security conscious, or an old military base that's being redeveloped. They usually had very few points of access for security purposes. So in all of these cases, in order to really bring that property fully back to life, you need to create viable new connections for it. And it's not just in urban situations. It's in ecological restoration too. Many times people will say, okay, here's an old farm. They exhausted their soil. The farmer went bankrupt. We're going to ecologically restore it now and return it to nature. But then they forget that it's surrounded by other farms, and there might be another protected area just a quarter of a mile away, but there are active farms or other derelict farms in between them. And in order to fully revitalize both of these protected areas, the traditional, the older protected area and the newly restored protected area, they need to connect them. So, for instance, wildlife often needs to migrate seasonally from the lowlands along the riparian areas to the mountaintops. So you could have a protected area or restored area on the mountaintop and a restored area along the river or the creek. But if you've got old farmland that hasn't been restored in between them, neither one of those ecosystems is going to come back to life. So you need to connect them. And sometimes just a tiny little restoration project will provide that connection between ecosystems, and both those ecosystems come back to life, sometimes without touching either one of the big ecosystems, simply by restoring a tiny piece of land that connects them.
Right. So it kind of radiates health between them to some degree if they're close enough.
Well, it allows for flows. Flows are the key. If you look through all these community revitalization programs that are really, really successful, you'll see that in addition to the buildings and the brownfields and all that, they focused on their infrastructure to maximize flows, because that's all infrastructure is. It's stuff that allows for flows, flows of traffic, flows of human beings, flows of information, flows of water, flows of waste.
So on the topic of farming, I actually had a couple questions for you on that, because I think it's kind of this area that's a little bit ironic when people want to think about getting back to nature and they picture farms, which are massively monocropped and completely the opposite of natural land. I was just wondering if you have any ideas about the future of farming, because it seems like, from what I gather, it seems like a lot of the topsoil is kind of being depleted, as you just kind of touched on. And I was wondering if anybody's moving towards like hybrid models. Like, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Three Sisters gardens. Have you heard of that?
No, not familiar with that.
So Three Sisters Gardens is squash. Traditionally, I think it's an indigenous thing. It's squash, corn, and peas.
Yeah, my wife is from Mexico. We spend a month or two in Mexico every year, so I'm very familiar with the the native Mexican type of agriculture. So now I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So I was wondering if we were moving into some sort of larger scale, more sustainable kind of hybrid model where you can get more food per square foot, or if we're using maybe like mushrooms. I'm curious if you know anything about these kind of ventures.
Yeah, sure. The big challenge we have now is that because we haven't been using sustainable methods like that corn, bean, and squash method that's kept farmlands alive in Mexico for centuries, actually for millennia, since it was invented by the indigenous folks there. Because we haven't been using that for the past few centuries, the big challenge now is actually restoring farmlands. As with virtually every other aspect of the environment, sustainability is not enough. In fact, it hasn't been enough for quite a while now. The only way we can possibly have a healthier, wealthier, more vibrant future is by restoring our natural resources, and that includes our farmlands. So forget about sustainable agriculture. Forget about sustainable anything. It's irrelevant now. Anybody who thinks that all we need to do is sustain the way things are right now is not paying attention. The world's in an absolute mess. We need to heal it. We need to remediate it. And so the big trend now is regenerative agriculture. And I actually had a chapter on regenerative agriculture in my first book, which, like I said, I started writing in 1996 when virtually nobody had ever heard of it outside of the Rodale Institute, where they were doing the research on it. So the restoration economy might have been the first book to ever have an actual chapter on regenerative agriculture. And now, in the last 5, 6, 7 years or so, it's absolutely exploded. And it exploded as a result of research that was revealed at an event I went to here in Washington, D.C., by a European organization called Regeneration International. And it was the first time it was revealed over at the National Press Club that regenerative agriculture sequestered carbon at a rate that was 4 times greater than reforestation. And all of a sudden, the traditional benefits of regenerative agriculture, which is restoring native pollinators, restoring local ecosystems, restoring watersheds, rebuilding topsoil, all of a sudden, the whole idea of restoring the climate was added to the regenerative agriculture agenda, and that's when it really took off.
This seems like something that big industry is involved in, and that it's not contrary to economic development. And I know you mentioned something about General Mills. I don't know if this is specifically what they're doing, but they are doing something in this realm, perhaps.
Oh, yeah. All the big ones, Cargill, General Mills, Nestle, all these huge agribusiness conglomerates are jumping into regenerative agriculture with both feet. Cargill just announced a 10 million acre initiative. Another one has got like a $10 billion initiative. It's very positive, but as usual, what happens when you get the huge corporations involved is that part of it tends to be eyewash, just good publicity, and part of it tends to be watered down concepts. So you'll often find some of these regenerative agriculture initiatives that have just basically been stripped down to no-till. And that's it. And no-till is obviously a very valuable part of the whole regenerative agriculture technique. It's not the only part of it. And by grossly simplifying it, in many ways undermining the regenerative agriculture movement, which is at a critical point right now, where it needs more support, it needs more research, and now people who really are concerned about the environment are seeing some of these superficial attempts. And, these are people who don't know anything about regenerative agriculture, and they take a look at that and say, well, there's nothing to that. That's just a minor modification on industrial agriculture. So they lose hope. They get a negative first impression of regenerative agriculture because their first exposure to it is one of these watered down corporate initiatives.
Right. And so it puts them on the defensive, or they just are not open to it. I was actually going to ask you about corporations and their interests here, because a lot of time I think people hear about how a giant corporation is polluting the environment, and then they do get caught and they get brought to court. And then if they do even end up getting punished, or it's like not tied up in the courts, the punishment is often so small that it actually still makes it worthwhile for them to continue polluting. Is that still an ongoing concern? Should we be thinking about that too?
Primary purpose of government is to keep the wealthy wealthy and the powerful powerful. So it's always going to be manipulated in such a way that any fines for misbehavior on the corporate part are basically going to be small enough that they can just be considered a cost of doing business.
Right. Yeah. It's just one of the line items they have to pay off to continue operating. So I guess another question is you're talking about like three things you mentioned were repurpose, renew, and reconnect. So that to me sounds like there would be, like you said, the waterfronts used to have industry there, and perhaps when they've moved out, they're trying to reuse the property or whatever. But suppose that there are still active pollutants in that kind of setting. What can a municipality do in that situation? Like, how should they tackle that?
When I first started writing the restoration economy in 1996, the EPA's brownfields program was 1 year old and organized industry and scientific disciplines around brownfields is actually quite new. People have been cleaning up brownfields for longer than that, but it was only in 1995 here in the U.S. that it became formalized and funded, and the EPA started handing out grants to communities so they could assess their brownfields, find out which properties are likely to be contaminated, and then actually start testing them, find out which ones really are contaminated. Because a brownfield isn't necessarily contaminated. It's a property that's either contaminated or perceived to be contaminated. And the problem is that nobody's going to buy it and redevelop it in either case. That might be contaminated. They don't want to end up being liable for the cleanup if they're not the ones who contaminated it. So over the last few decades, it's turned into a huge industry, and there are, absolutely vast cleanup projects going on. There was one, I believe, the Jacobs Engineering Company recently won I forget the size of it now. It was huge, somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 billion.
Wow. A
single government contract to clean up an old nuclear research facility. It was just heavily contaminated by radiation. So it's really big business. How you go about doing it, there are over 10,000 man-made contaminants on the planet, and many of them require very different ways of contaminating them. And then the way you go about doing it is going to be determined not just by chemistry, but also by the realities of your situation. How much money do you have to work with now? Are you going to have to do this slowly over a long period of time? Or do you have the money to dive right in and do it quickly so you can redevelop the property right away? Time and money are fungible. So if you don't have the money, then you have to replace that money with time, in which case you can do things like in situ, meaning you're not going to ex situ is the fast way of doing it. In the bad old days, the ex situ remediation, I put quotes around that word remediation, meant basically coming in with bulldozers and dump trucks, hauling out the contaminated land, and here in the States, usually dumping it on Native American reservations. That went on for well over a decade. And then they got caught doing that and decided that maybe what they needed to do was clean it up. So instead of dumping it on Native American land, they started taking it to facilities where the soil would be decontaminated, usually with a way that destroyed the climate, because they basically heated up the soil to a point where it destroyed the contaminants, which required vast amounts of energy. The more ecologically sound way of doing it, if you have the time, is, as you mentioned earlier, you said mushrooms. There's Phyto Remediation, where you can use plants to take up the contaminants, and there are different kinds of plants take up different kinds of heavy metals and other contaminants. And then you can harvest those plants, turn them into biofuel, or extract the contaminants from them. Or you can use, mycoremediation, which is fungi, which is really good at breaking down petrochemical pollution.
I know Phil popped in and out there. I didn't know if you had anything to add to this particular topic.
I missed a chunk in the middle there because I dropped, but I see we're coming near the end there. I guess, Steve, I'll let you ask the last question if you have any.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, because all of this is kind of governance level, municipal, community type political things. And I'm wondering if the average person hears this and really it resonates with them, and they are really buying into this is what we need, and they're passionate, but they feel like, okay, what can I actually do? What would you recommend for the average person listening?
Depends who they are. If they're a neighborhood volunteer, there's one approach. If they're already in city government, there's another. But there is one approach that really is appropriate no matter whether they're a mayor, a neighborhood activist, a planner, an architect, or whatever. And that's if they want to increase the likelihood that their local revitalization efforts will be a success, they need to plug in that missing process. And the easiest way to do that is to get certified as a revitalization and resilience facilitator by the organization I run, Reconomics Institute, at reconomics.org. And the tuition for it's only $299. As a matter of fact, if your listeners are interested in doing that, when you enroll, you can use the coupon code CRISIS, just the word crisis. It's a coupon I came up with at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, and that'll save them $100 on their tuition. So they can get certified as a revitalization resilience facilitator, which means they can be the person who's at the table who understands how to put together a complete process that'll help all of those other talented professionals out there and all those wonderful projects coalesce into successful revitalization.
Very nice.
It's a pleasure having you here, and we really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for coming on. So can you repeat your website there or anywhere else that they would want to reach you?
Yeah, Reconomics Institute is reconomics.org. If you go to stormcunningham.com, which is my public speaking site, you can basically find links to everything I do there. My books, organizations, Revitalization, which is at revitalization.org, which is put out twice a month and has over 8,500 articles from past issues in it. So anything you want to find out about, any stories you want to read about of revitalization, resilience, redevelopment, remediation, ecological restoration, those stories are all there at revitalization.org.
And maybe we can even include a link to your TED Talk, which was something that we both really enjoyed and thoroughly, because the images there, just seeing the images of some of the streams that you've shown before and after a revitalization project in Chattanooga and all the rest of it. I mean, just that visual component, again, your humor, it's something worth checking out. So we'll link that as well.
Oh, glad you liked it. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us, and we'll be sure to let you know when this airs.
All right. Thanks, Steve and Phil. Appreciate being on your show.
Thanks for coming on.
You do this all the time, you liar.
You liar.
You did some decent co-hosting there.
I'm a worthy co-host who can ask smart questions.